Welcome to the Made in Migration podcast, brought to you by Lawgration, the specialist law firm that helps navigate the complex world of Australian immigration and citizenship law. Here we'll talk about all things to do with migrating to Australia. We're going to learn, grow and be inspired together. Make sure you subscribe and let us be partners on your journey. You're listening to a Lawgration production. This podcast is intended for education and or entertainment purposes only. All content is current at the time of recording and subject to change without prior notice. While Lawgration is an incorporated legal practice, we are not aware of your personal circumstances, needs or goals, and information contained in this podcast should not be construed as legal, immigration or other advice. Before acting on any information in this podcast, you should always query whether it is relevant to your circumstances and consult an Australian immigration lawyer or registered migration agent. Today on Made in Migration, we're joined by a remarkable Australian whose career spans law, business, public service and global philanthropy. Peter McMullin AM has an extensive legal and business career encompassing prominent roles in both the public and private sectors. In 2021, Peter became a member of the Order of Australia for significant service to business, law and the community. In business, Peter is the chairman and director of McMullin, a diversified family business based in Melbourne. Peter is also president of the Confederation of Asia-Pacific Chambers of Commerce and Industry, spanning 27 countries in the region with offices in Melbourne, Singapore and Taipei. In 2019, Peter established the Good Business Foundation, which focuses on supporting inclusive and sustainable small and medium-sized businesses in the Asia-Pacific region. In 2022, he was appointed by the President of Timor-Leste to the position of Presidential Envoy, Private Sector and Investment Cooperation for Timor-Leste. In 2023, he was awarded the Collar of the Order of Timor-Leste, the highest award given to a civilian for his service to the country. In the 1990s, Peter was member of the former Refugee Review Tribunal, where he conducted merits review of protection visa refusals. In the early 2000s, he founded and scaled his own boutique law firm based in Melbourne. In his representative and governance roles, Peter has held board positions with WorkSafe Victoria and currently the Melbourne Recital Centre and the Australian Chamber Orchestra. He is also the Honorary Consul of Georgia in Victoria and former Honorary Consul for Timor-Leste in Victoria. As a philanthropist, Peter has helped create long-lasting impact, including founding the world's first academic centre dedicated to the issue of statelessness, the Peter McMullin Centre on Statelessness at Melbourne Law School. Some of Peter's past roles include Councillor and Deputy Lord Mayor for the City of Melbourne, Councillor and Mayor at the City of Greater Geelong, President of the Victorian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Chairman of the Melbourne International Comedy Festival, Deputy President of Museums Board of Victoria, Board Member of Philanthropy Australia, Board Member of the Victorian Curriculum and Assessment Authority, Director of the National Portrait Gallery of Australia and President of Geelong Art Gallery. We're absolutely honoured to welcome him today to reflect on a life of leadership and giving back. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Peter, your career spans law, business, diplomacy, the arts and philanthropy. Can you take us back to the beginning? What shaped your worldview growing up, and did migration play any part in your early life or family story?
The quick answer to the second part of your question is no, it didn't. But a lot of events influenced my global outlook. Right from an early age, and I was always interested in a wider world. And I was, in fact, at school, I was the editor of the news board, which I posted every day on significant developments from the newspapers on the board at school, and did that for a number of years, and edited the school magazine. And so I was always very involved in sharing the information, stuff that I'd seen around the place and what I thought people were interested in. And, I then, I went to Papua New Guinea on a school trip and lived in a village for 3 months. And really, for a middle-class boy from Melbourne, it was quite an eye-opener, really. And I couldn't imagine at that time, having had all the benefits of education here in Melbourne, that people could live in the way that they lived in Papua New Guinea. And it led to a lifetime of awareness around development issues and the importance of us, speaking broadly in the West, engaging with the developing world, because, people start from so far behind that it's impossible sometimes to imagine that a whole life could be lived in those circumstances. But anyway, and so, look, that led to a very long involvement in Timor-Leste, which is, you've mentioned in the introduction, and I've been there for many years. That involvement was triggered by the death of Greg Shackleton, who I knew, who was one of the journalists who was shot by the Indonesians in the invasion in 1975. And I was at a party with him in North Carlton, and he said he was going as a journalist to go up to Timor to witness this invasion. And, but very soon thereafter he was killed. And there was a complete cover-up for many years, and a New South Wales coroner ultimately determined that they were deliberately shot by the Indonesians. So it was completely, there was no information for many years. But so anyway, that Timor involvement has continued, and I've set up a Chamber of Commerce in Timor, and that's still up and running. And the aim of that is to diversify the economy away from oil, which they're heavily dependent on. And that's, proving fruitful still. So, it does permeate my whole life, sort of a balance between economic outcomes and development outcomes.
Peter, how did your legal training influence your approach to leadership across such diverse sectors?
Well, I think any solicitors listening to this, I encourage them to use the skill which they use in every day, and that is to have that experience of a client who every day thinks that what you're dealing with them is the only thing you have to do. Now, when you're, as a solicitor, juggling 500 clients or something, which I have been in that situation, and I don't want to return to it, but I think you develop great skills at juggling different pieces of information, and it's a skill set which lawyers, I think, actually have, but they don't consciously use it enough. I really encourage people to, you can do lots of things because you're doing it anyway in your day-to-day work, because, you can't spend all your day on one client. I mean, you've obviously have to spend it on a number of people, and so they've got to feel that you are 100% devoted to their case. So anyway, that's a little diversion. But look, basically, I think the leadership question is an important one, because I think there's different types of leadership, and mine, I was recently published in a book by a good friend of mine, Brian Donovan, who wrote a book about the gentle art of leadership. He's gathered a number of people, and I recommend his book. But I was interviewed for that, and I think I'm interested in that collaborative leadership and engaging with people most directly, and allowing people in organisations where I'm involved with to really do their best where they can, not to be overly directive, but equally guide people in the best directions that I can imagine. So, in all cases, it's something I've done a lot of, and I've seen a lot of very good organisations, and I've seen a lot of not so good ones.
You've worked in various roles as legal practitioner, and you're heavily involved, of course, with the former Refugee Review Tribunal in your capacity as member. How have you seen the legal profession change in its approach to migration and human rights issues over the decades?
Oh, interesting question. Look, I was involved with others in setting up the Fitzroy Legal Service handbook, and the section on immigration still contains little bits that I wrote all those years ago. So, but look, in Fitzroy, my practice was in Collingwood, and Fitzroy was just across Smith Street from where I was. And of course, Fitzroy Legal Service was in the Town Hall and in Brunswick Street. and there are a lot of people with migration issues. And so it was a very large part of my practice in that area. And I always felt that there wasn't too much sympathy for them in the Department of Immigration as it then was. And so they really required some advocacy, particularly people where English wasn't the first language. I mean, the obstacles put in their way of actually achieving outcomes is difficult enough for lawyers. But for people on their own, they're just, they're just really not able to. Look, I haven't directly practiced in this area some while, but when I was on the Refugee Review Tribunal in the 90s, I mean, people used to come to Australia to see how we did it. We were seen as a very humane, clear tribunal, applying a rule which was about the either the
Convention.
The convention, but there was a real chance of persecution if they were returned. I think we did that pretty well. But the politics has changed as well. And the law has in some ways followed the politics, but there's still lots of good lawyers doing great work. And I support Refugee Legal, for example. David Mann and his team, they do a fantastic job. But, the policy environment is not all that conducive to successful outcomes. So it's more of a battle now than it was. And it was a battle then. So I don't want to gloss over. Don't say there were good old days, because there weren't really. But it just hasn't improved much, I don't think, is what I would say. So I admire those who are working in that area, because it's an important area and it's often not regarded as important. When it was sort of bipartisan policy that we would make life difficult for refugees, I really personally was challenged about, well, what can I do about this? I've had a lot of involvement in politics and in different ways, but on this issue, we have not made enough traction. So I felt, what do I do? And so I decided to fund the establishment of the Centre on Statelessness in the law school. And I have to tell you, when I was on the tribunal, even though it was good, we used to treat stateless people just as refugees, and, they were rejected because they weren't actually refugees. Because, there's just a clear distinction, and they are a class of person who needs to be addressed sympathetically, because there's nothing worse than not having a state. I mean, you've got no capacity to marry, to own property. And there are people in Australia, and the centre has established quite a lot of data which didn't previously exist about the extensiveness of the stateless population in Australia. We've set up a stateless legal clinic which now assists families who, children of stateless couples, do acquire a right by right of their birth in Australia. And this is not widely understood, but the clinic provides that advice to the people, and that is, I know from my personal knowledge, many hundreds of families have been assisted through that process.
For our listeners that may not necessarily have heard, so this is the Peter McMullin Centre on Statelessness at Melbourne Law School, and I understand it's the only one of its kind in this area, in the Asia Pacific region at least. Peter, what prompted you to establish that? Of course, you generously contributed to its establishment. What was the process like for you?
Well, I think all what I mentioned before led up to it. I felt it was a practical measure, because there is still not a stateless determination procedure in Australia. And I did have discussions with the Federal Attorney General over the last couple of years, and was hopeful that issue might be picked up, because there really doesn't need to be a determination procedure that gives some people some rights on the basis of them being declared a stateless person. Now, listeners will remember that this is the way the Nazi regime dealt with the Jews, and they were actually declared stateless. There's not so many of them who've survived, but it is an issue that is ever present. It is probably likely to grow. It's a resort of authoritarian regimes, and different regimes around the world have actually excised certain sections of the population they don't like and declared them stateless. So this is a growing area. So in answer to your question, though, I think it was largely wanting to do something in response to Australia's, I think, inadequate treatment of migration issues. But, I agree that it's a contested space. I wanted to do something that was positive in that space, and I felt statelessness was a very under. And Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, beamed into our launch back in 2018. He said it was the last unmet human rights need in the world and congratulated me for that. I mean, I was very appreciative of that. But, it is an important issue and it's largely unknown. But look, they're doing some great work.
On the home front, is there specific policy work that they do, or perhaps even internationally?
Yeah, well, look, there's a network globally out of the UNHCR in Geneva and in New York, and so they're connected into the global efforts in this space. And there was, in 2018 when he set up, there was a campaign to rid the world of statelessness by 2024. Now, we're now 2025 and it's still with us. And I think a new campaign is being developed. But there's an active European network of statelessness offices in different places around Europe. So look, there's a lot of work being done, and the Melbourne Centre is really engaging very actively policy development with them, and also people doing doctorates on specific issues.
I think that's just phenomenal work that the centre does. It is really unique, I think, in Australia. And without your contributions, it just wouldn't have gotten off the ground.
I just congratulate Melbourne University for having developed this idea, because I came along when they were just looking for someone to actually fund it. And so, Carolyn Evans, who was then the Dean of the Law School, he met with me and they embraced the idea. The then Vice-Chancellor, Glyn Davis, embraced the idea. Duncan Maskell, who was the Vice-Chancellor, embraced the idea. And, you can't go into the law school now without seeing something about statelessness in the foyer. And so, look, I applaud them for the way they've responded to it.
Peter, what inspired you to establish the Good Business Foundation, I understand, back in 2019? What gap were you hoping to fill there with that?
In all my work, I've seen the disparities between what people do in the sustainability space at the macro level and what they've done at the social enterprise level, so the micro. But in the middle is the SME space, which is often overlooked. And this is where I've been all my professional life. I was president of the Victorian Chamber of Commerce. I'm on all these international bodies to do with promoting business. And the whole mindset globally now is to achieve success sustainably. This is a message that is I think undercooked in Australia. And I'm seeing in a lot of our region a lot of embracing of this by governments, because they know that the world is changing and that there will be obstacles to trade if you can't present what you're doing in the sustainability space. So it's both educative and also, fits the interest I have in trying to match business and development. They're both complex, and there's no single thing that defines business. There's no single thing that defines development. But I'm aware that they're so interconnected. We need to encourage, and so we're funding a lot of through the Good Business Foundation, a lot of women entrepreneurs, for example, in East Timor, who are. The women in Timor, it's a fairly patriarchal society. I don't mean to criticise it, but women who have succeeded in business in Timor have overcome a number of obstacles, which, timid souls just wouldn't get through it. So you just see some amazingly enterprising women but there's no framework for them to develop their businesses. And so we're providing, business advice, finance and access to finance and different networks that they can help them expand their businesses. And we're doing that in partnership with the Department of Foreign Affairs. So there's a joint funding between our foundation and the federal DFAT. And, I went on a tour recently to Indonesia where we went to a chili farm, which was run by the women in East Java. And honestly, the capacity of them, with a bit of support from an organisation called Good Return, which I fund, but Good Return lends small amounts of money to young entrepreneurs in Indonesia and other countries. And the women all pay the money back, but it actually enables them to actually start their businesses. And you see this amazing transformation in this village. They're now got more chili than they need for their own purposes. So they're now exporting from this East Javanese village. So, lots and lots of examples of those sorts of things.
How immensely satisfying that would be to see the net good that is produced and distributed amongst society. And it's phenomenal. I guess migration and economic mobility often go hand in hand. I'm wondering whether you've observed any overlap between the Good Business Foundation's work and the broader challenges or opportunities of migration in the Asia-Pacific region specifically.
Those examples I just gave are examples, but look, we were recently in Japan, and young entrepreneurs there are doing what we call the wrestle. Now, the wrestle in this business is to how to make money and do good at the same time. And so a lot of these young entrepreneurs, for example, in Japan, recently, it was only a couple of weeks ago, were the beneficiaries of their own families' businesses and wanting to do something different, wanting to contribute in the region and to actually help society. Now, we've got lots of ideas about that, and they are joining our network for that reason, because it helps them come up with ideas and introduces them to other people with the same dilemmas. Because for those 30 to 50-year-olds, this climate transition and decarbonisation, everything like that, is an existential question. And it is important for them to understand the tools that are available, because there are plenty of tools available. But once again, I think we are doing some things in Australia, but we're lagging in the region in terms of what other governments are actually doing to encourage their business communities to really push the needle further in the sustainability direction. But that involves leadership also within the business community. And I'm going to Singapore next week, and their government has told the business community, you've got to get on with it, otherwise we're going to lose trade into Europe because of the carbon border mechanisms. So if you can't prove your scope 2, 3 emissions, you're not going to get the trade, quite apart from all the other issues in trade at the moment, which are enormous.
Out of curiosity, isn't one of the main reasons that's cited as why the EU-Australia Free Trade Agreement hasn't necessarily been closed yet? Isn't that's sort of often reported?
Correct. And I've been encouraging that to happen, but, there's got to be some Europe, it's very hard to talk about Europe as one thing at the moment. It's just a free trade agreement between us and Europe would be a very sensible thing. And I think the government is moving closer to achieving that. But, these issues are very much important in that, and they take them very seriously. So, anybody negotiating this would need to understand that, and I'm sure they do.
Would you like to see any sort of specific immigration or initiatives, visas perhaps, or types of visas that would better promote or enable this sort of mobility between our neighbours and Australia, particularly at that entrepreneurial level?
I would. And, the government is doing some good things. The expansion of the PALM scheme to include Timor is upping that, from the current 5,000 to 10,000. And it's highly popular in Timor. And the people I know go on that program and save enough money to go back and start their businesses in Timor. Now, that's a positive thing for Timor, and it's positive for Australia because, they're doing jobs which are difficult to get people to do in Australia, but it's highly popular in Timor. And in fact, the remittances from overseas labour is actually one of the biggest sources of income in Timor. And, this is often overlooked as a benefit. But similarly in other countries in the region, Vanuatu, Fiji, and there is increasing numbers of these schemes, and the Palm scheme is one of them. But look, there's other targeting specific entrepreneurs. We could probably do more because Australia is an attractive destination for a lot of people, and they can contribute back to their countries via their work here.
During your time as Deputy Lord Mayor of Melbourne and Deputy President of the Victorian Chamber of Commerce, you would have had a front row seat to the economic contributions of migrants. What stands out to you from those years about how migration shapes a city like Melbourne?
Oh, I think it's fundamental to Melbourne. I mean, absolutely fundamental. And I mean, there have been waves of migration that are just still happening, and different contributions from different communities. One of the important things for the Victorian Chamber, which I was the president of, it is to diversify its membership to include representatives of those migrant communities, because there are different drivers of each of those communities that, in business and what their focus was. But, look, I went to a brilliant Sri Lankan play last night in Melbourne. There's a huge Sri Lankan community in Melbourne. And I went to another one, but my organisation has got an office in Colombo. This Sri Lankan population in Melbourne is absolutely huge. I don't think I ever saw a Sri Lankan business person in the Victorian Chamber of Commerce industry. And it's not criticism of anyone. It's just we don't institutionalise the need to actually engage with these communities that are so important to our economy. Quite apart from our social, the mix, our multicultural success story, which it is. But there are challenges always. But I think the old days of business just being about making money alone are over, and organisations need to represent. They're part of society, and the SME sector contributes 50% of global emissions. Now, if the SME sector is not geared up to address global emissions, for example, we're not going to get to net zero. Now, there's going to be challenges to do that anyway, but the SME sector has to be engaged in this issue.
It'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the arts, given your interests and long-running patronage of that industry. So you and your family have made significant contributions to the arts in Australia over the years. How do you see the arts playing a role in telling the stories of migrants or fostering greater inclusion as an industry, the arts industry?
Well, look, it's a passion of mine. It's been a passion of mine forever. And I was once a soprano voice singer in Oliver at Her Majesty's Theatre in Melbourne in 1966. Now, that's going back a way. Now, but, I kept in contact with a whole lot of people in the theatre scene as a result of that experience. And I felt madly in love with Tony Lamond at the stage. She's now in Sydney in poor health. But she was Nancy in Oliver, and she was going through a rough period in her life. And it just so happened that little Peter McMullin came along and we became great friends. And I've still got the letters which we exchanged at the time. Letters, remember those? I mean, no one writes letters anymore. But that was letters that, I treasure. But anyway, so I've been involved in lots of things and telling the stories. I mean, I mentioned the Sri Lankan show I went to last night. Now, I went to the Counting and Cracking, which was at Melbourne University, a Sri Lankan play. It was epochal. It was 4 hours long. And there was an interval. But all the Sri Lankan population in Melbourne came to it, and they were all laughing at these different things. And I didn't know what they were laughing at. I mean, because there was so much reference to their history and their culture and their background. It was brilliant. But sharing it with them was a really important part of the experience.
Now, congratulations on your recent appointment as chair of the Melbourne Recital Centre. What does this role mean to you personally, and how does it align with your lifelong engagement in the arts?
I think music's been part of my life all the way through, and I think just before this interview, I had ABC Classic on, and I work away with that in the background. And music has been such a foundational issue for me. And so to be appointed as chair of the Melbourne Recital Centre is indeed a great honour. But it's a great facility in South Bank, and my job is to let more people know about its existence, because I think, and just picking up on the multicultural theme for a moment, I mean, I think we need to reach out to more of the diverse multicultural communities to celebrate their musical traditions as one of the offerings that happen at the Recital Centre. But, we are really diversifying the range of musical offerings, right through to contemporary stuff and as well as classical. So, look, it's a great facility, and it's regarded by artists as one of the great auditoriums in the world. Because of its particular design, and it's a great honour, as I said.
Looking across your career, is there a particular moment or particular project, perhaps with the centre or local government, where you saw the real impact of your work on a migrant or stateless person's life?
It's a good question. There's been many, but look, at the moment, I would say the Stateless Legal Clinic, where it's actually, helping people who actually wouldn't know they had that right to attain that right. Now, that can be transformational for families to have children, with citizenship rights bestowed on them, at a time of incredible uncertainty. So, but look, there's so many. I mentioned the women in Indonesia. I mean, just seeing the transformation that a relatively small amount of money could achieve for them to grow their business and grow their self-sufficiency.
Peter, what would you say to aspiring migrants who are looking to build careers that bridge sectors like law, business and social impact, as you have? What would you say to them?
I never had a plan. There's never been a plan. I mean, I just want to say that. And this has evolved basically out of my own interest. And find your interest, find what drives you and what really fascinates you, because, it's a lifelong thing sometimes. And if you can actually identify what that is and go with it and join up not-for-profits or in community organisations, make a contribution, get involved, because there's a real need at the moment. I mean, the older generation has done a lot of volunteering over the time, and now they're moving on. And look, there's a real need for younger generations to pick up that mantle, not only in volunteering terms, but probably in financial terms as well, so that we maintain the society that we've got. Because you can't take any of this for granted. It's just, governments are under enormous pressure to fund everything, and they won't be able to do it. And, and so it's going to be important. The volunteer
Giving
back sector is a really worthwhile thing. And I can tell you from my own life experience, it's been immensely rewarding.
Finally, what gives you hope about Australia's future and how we approach particularly migration and belonging? What gives you hope?
I'm hopeful that, the young entrepreneurs group of our organisation is global. So I'm not going to speak solely about Australia, but it is global, and it's an enthusiastic generation who are actually trying to solve some of the problems which we've bequeathed, and they're major ones. And it's I am encouraged and I am hopeful about them solving some of these issues, but it won't be for lack of trying, because I'm really impressed by some of the young entrepreneurs and their ideas and what they want to do. So that's the source of my hope. And I mean, I've always leant on the optimistic side of things. There is still a lot of community, a lot of people who want to do the right thing, and we need to make sure they're supported to do that.
Thank you so much for your time, Peter. Your journey across law, business, public life, and philanthropy is not only remarkable in its scope, but deeply anchored in purpose, inclusion, and service. From championing good business practices in the Asia Pacific to helping give voice and protection to stateless people through the centre that bears your name, your work reminds us that migration, leadership, and generosity are deeply interconnected. On behalf of our listeners, thank you for your contributions and for sharing your story with us on Made in Migration.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
You've been listening to a Lawgration production. This podcast is intended for education and/or entertainment purposes only. All content is current at the time of recording and subject to change without prior notice. While Lawgration is an incorporated legal practice, we are not aware of your personal circumstances, needs, or goals, and information contained in this podcast should not be construed as legal, immigration, or other advice. Before acting on any information in this podcast, you should always query whether it is relevant to your circumstances and consult an Australian immigration lawyer or registered migration agent.